Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to moderate this roundtable. And I just want to reinforce before we start that please ask questions using the Slido app. We'll take questions within different time of the roundtable and not only at the end. So please react and share your thoughts with us. So my first question to all of you might be a bit of a difficult one, but it's what are the most important ways in which you think AI can or will fail?
So who goes first?
You go.
Right, well, it's a really important question about how it will fail. I think that it's important to remember that it is our technology, and what we can do is look at the ways that it is failing right now. And I think the biggest concern everybody has right now is democracy. So I think we've seen, even since the Arab Spring, that we can use all these new tools to tear things down, but we've been less good at building things up. So I guess that's one of the things I very much worry about. And then the other one is if people feel too constrained so that we become too homogenous because we all think we know what the exact right thing is, then our society becomes fragile and also we as individuals become horribly inhibited. And I guess the third one would be, sorry, I thought it was three, is if we use machines to do all the hard thinking for us, then we literally will become stupider because we won't use our own brains. And brains are parts of bodies, just like muscles. If you don't use them, if you don't have cognitively challenging tasks. So if we use AI to keep changing things really rapidly, then we should get smarter and smarter. But if we use AI to solve all the problems, like how do you get around Paris on the metro, then we may become stupider.
Maybe Jade, you want to add something to this?
I agree with all those things, and I think one of the main things that worries me about artificial intelligence systems isn't so much particular failure modes of particular systems, but it's the general idea that I think the more that we use these systems, we'll be making trade-offs between what we want to prioritize in the short term versus what we want to prioritize in the long term. And I think that worries me, particularly from a social kind of governance perspective, which is where a lot of my research is, in that you'll see that we have incentives to do things like use artificial intelligence in the military context or use artificial intelligence to speed up the way that we make decisions in very complex environments just because we want to win in that particular instance. But I think in that case, that means that you're quite likely to trade off things like how safe those systems are, how robust those systems are, and in the long run, we wouldn't have wanted to make those choices. But in the short run, there's these competitive incentives to make that the case. So I'd say that's kind of one overarching thing that worries me as a failure mode, is that these kind of long-term, short-term trade-offs will be sort of forced to make them in this competitive space, particularly when you think about artificial intelligence as a very competitive technology that a lot of big firms and big countries are going for. And then when we look back in the long run, we'll see that we'll have traded off a bunch of values that we actually really care about.
Okay, so I do agree with everything what was said here. I have two things to say. First, when we talk about artificial intelligence today, I think that everyone understands that it's computer programs that are able to take information from a lot of data. And that's what artificial intelligence is about right now. It used to be not very different back in the days. It was something a bit different. And one of the things that is very important is for the people to learn how to provide data, how to protect their data, and how to trust the systems that use artificial intelligence, which brings me to the other problem, in addition to the problem of knowing how to deliver your data, is the problem of anticipating how the systems that use machines are going to work with humans. So that's the reason why that recently you have questions like augmented intelligence instead of artificial intelligence, because there's this question of how the systems that we build that are very efficient to predict very difficult things, but at the same time poses questions related to ethics. That's the question. That's the reason why people now think about the question of having a good collaboration, a good cooperation between humans and machines. And the question is, the problem is if each of the fields go in their separate ways, which I think is not going to be the case, but there might be a fear in this direction.
Yes, you want to add something, Joanna?
So I hope it's okay if we have one of these cool panels where we disagree. So you've just reminded me of another big way to fail, which is to think that the machines themselves are the actors. So I worry when we talk about cooperation with the machines, we cooperate through the machines with other humans and human agencies. So I don't know if we're disagreeing or not, because you're nodding. Okay, so maybe it was just a phrasing thing. Yeah, okay, all right.
I just want to ask you on that subject if each of you had a very compelling, very concrete example of you experimenting an AI or seeing something that you were really shocked by its failure. Like, I don't know, you understand my question? Or like one program that you saw, or one result or consequence of AI that failed that you really were shocked with?
We can all say that everybody who builds AI can say that most of what we do fails, which is just it doesn't work at all. Right? But I think the thing that was most shocking to me was the extent. I showed quickly something about where I had an intuition that we should be able to mine implicit bias out of human language. And what was shocking wasn't a failure, but a success. We didn't expect it to be a completely perfect mining, and we didn't expect it to replicate human reality. And so suddenly we were onto something that was telling us a lot about how humans thought. And I was fortunate that I had two co-authors that politically we were all in the same place, and so we were all still able to write a paper that wasn't horrible, basically. Because some people would say, okay, this proves that actually, women are more domestic or something. Yeah. They could have taken it in a much more negative way. So I guess the most terrifying when we say AI failure is actually success. That too much control of other humans, too much knowledge that constrains our human experience.
Building on that, actually, I think there's a set of examples. I don't work with AI systems directly much, but there's an incredible resource online called the Concrete Problems in AI Safety paper, and that steps through a number of different ways in which AI systems fail in ways that are a lot of the time a lot smarter than we expect them to. And so an example here is a type of failure mode called reward hacking, where you've got, say, a reinforcement learning system and you give it some kind of objective function and it's trying to rack up the points to win. And these systems do all these incredibly creative and somewhat hilarious things to win. So for example, if you're having it play, say, a tic-tac-toe game, the way that it'll win the game is it'll extend the board to infinity number of squares, and so you can't ever actually have the winning sort of algorithm fail. And things like that, I think, don't seem as guttural or as visceral to sort of your everyday person thinking about how AI systems fail. But the reason why, for a person like me, that's a concrete example of something which is a failure mode that I think is an important one to recognize, is it shows that you can't, no matter how hard you try, it's often quite difficult to specify your objective function exactly as intended, and that there are risks of unintended behaviors cropping up. And if you deploy systems like that in the real world, then unintended consequences can crop up as well. So that little cluster of kind of unintended accident behavior, that's an example that comes to mind there.
And I think you started answering my next question, but maybe Liva can take on, which is, which is, what are the mechanisms that kind of lead to these failures? What do we observe, this kind of thing that we've just been describing?
Okay, one of the failures that I see is not actually it's a success of so I'm going to talk about machine learning. When you have a large data set of information and you have to extract data and knowledge from that, and the thing that happens here, it's not a failure of machine learning, it's more a failure of humans, is to think that it's totally objective, that the thing that the machine is going to do is, or the programs is going to do is totally objective, because you just look at the data and you don't have any biases, but they are hidden actually. There are a lot of biases, and I remember in a conference, a very famous conference in machine learning, which is NIPS, there used to be a speaker coming not from machine learning, from the technical side of machine learning, but from the ethical side of the machine learning, and they reported, she reported a study on how they used machine learning to do prediction for criminality or something like that, and it turned out that the machine was very able to predict who would be the people who were gonna do some crimes again, but it was based on very few features like gender, like ethnicity, and things like that. And it was just a reproduction or it was the human biases were magnified by the machines, but they were not. The prediction was not that as objective as intended, as expected, actually. And that's one of the problems, thinking that because those are machines and they just work on data, that they are going to be very objective, they're not going to have any biases, whereas there are a lot of biases coming just from the fact that from the way you collect the data, the way you provide your information on you. So that's one of the source of failure of artificial intelligence.
Yes.
Yeah. No, it's a beautiful illustration of intelligence is just intelligence. And so one of the things that these experiments shows us is to help us understand how we fall into these stereotypes. It's because if you're trying to describe the winning paper of NeurIPS, right, year after year, every one of them is a unique thing, right? It's a unique, novel thing that excited the judges. So there's no common pattern, that you're going to be able to detect easily with pattern recognition, but you can detect that they're all male and they're all from, Stanford or something, right? If that just pops out as a regularity, that is a secondary regularity about who wound up, going into computer science and which universities were already known to be good, so the good people tried to go to them. Those kinds of feedback systems. So it's interesting. I thought of one other total failure mode, which is actually failure, which is not so much a failure of AI, but if we all are dependent, say, on GPS, and then we're at war and somebody takes down the GPS network, can people find their way home? So Dan Dennett is talking about how we ought to shut down the internet for like 3 hours every year at some point, just to make sure everybody knows how to work without it. And people are saying, but people would die, like our hospital systems, whatever, depend on the internet. He's like, well, but that's the point. This is like vaccination. You need to make sure that you aren't fatally exposed. So that's another.
I think you really underlined two major points, with problem being in the data, and then you've underlined the people problem, that it might be coded by people who are quite alike. So in a more general, is it a people, a technology problem? How do both relate? How being maybe a male from Stanford influence how you would design the AI, and how would this lead to failure? No, you still don't.
Unfortunately, it's also the acoustics in here are a little weird, so I wasn't entirely sure.
Yeah, no, I'm saying, how do you relate the people who design and define this AI and the technology itself?
I think your question is it something like how much of this is a people problem versus a technology problem or something like that?
Yeah.
Maybe my quick take on that, and we'll sort of bounce it back to you as well. I think, the obvious answer is that it's both, and there are technical problems with these systems, and some of those technical problems are a result of people problems. There are also people problems with these systems, which even if you get the technicalities of it right, there'll still be problems with the system. Maybe to highlight what I think of as a category of the kind of people problems, which is kind of in the space here of even if you get a technically robust and safe system, you're still going to have problems with deploying artificial intelligence. And I think a lot of that brings you into this governance question. So what do we actually need governance institutions to do, and what are they for in order to prevent some of these failure modes? And I think that type of problem looks something like There are a number of different reasons to want to develop really advanced artificial intelligence systems. And some of those will lead us to deploy systems in the real world which don't really track what we as humanity want to see. A really prominent example lately is the militarization of artificial intelligence systems. And I wouldn't say there are many public citizens who are eager for our militaries to become that much more capable and automated. But there are a number of institutions in this world, governments being one significant one of them, where the incentives for them to develop really advanced military systems is a very clear one. So I'd say that's a category of people problems where the incentives of very powerful actors who have the resource to invest in these kinds of systems will pursue them, and the result of that is stuff that maybe we don't necessarily want to see.
Yeah. I think part of the reason I was confused by the problem is, to me, artificial intelligence is, well, basically technology we use to act already. So I have trouble separating the people problems from the technology problems. If anything, as we were just talking about, we keep enhancing, but also solving. I mean, don't forget, there's 4 billion fewer people in extreme poverty than there was in 2000. I mean, that's incredible. More than half of humanity has gotten out of the condition of extreme poverty. Why? I don't want to say it's entirely artificial intelligence, but I do think it has a lot to do with ICT and communication. That people are able to find out what's a fair price. They can't be as easily exploited. So everyone is more connected in it, and everyone is getting more of the benefits of being in humanity. But on the failure side, one of the things I really worry about that I see both in Britain and in America is people want to eliminate chance events for their children. So they, for example, they don't want it to be that you happen to have had that great teacher that helped you see who you were as a person and projected you into this unusual career track that made you into, James Baldwin or someone interesting, They are worried about, they don't like these chance event things, so they try to make every teacher the same. And that reduces the quality of the overall, you may be building up the floor, but you're reducing the possibilities. And in an age of AI, the last thing we need is a bunch of children who all know the same thing, because we can train a machine that knows that same thing too, right? We actually should be specializing and diversifying, and we should all want to have, co-create really interesting kids with all the teachers we can manage to find. Yes, there can be arbitrary bad things happen, but there's, we need to sort of embrace that, so I think that's another failure mode.
So, unless you want to add something, we'll now take a few questions from the audience. So they should be projected here. Please. Yes. So let's take the first one. What are the best recipes to avoid bias during data collection besides domain expertise? So maybe, Liva, you want to take up that one?
Wow. The question was good.
Up to besides domain expertise.
Because it's very hard to explain how you do that without being very technical. So just so you know, in all the conferences or the journal dedicated to machine learning, now there is a track dedicated or a workshop dedicated to fairness, equity, and things like that on machine learning. And people try to put aside the domain knowledge and try to come up with ideas to get rid of all the biases. And to do that, you have a lot of work on causality and on statistical independence, things about correlation, but they're pretty technical. So those are technical things that people work on. They try to not rely on domain expertise, because it's not that easy, but it's easier. It's an easier task to tackle when you have some knowledge from the domain. But my only answer is it's very difficult. You have some setting where you say you have some assumptions on the kind of biases that you're going to try to track, and given those hypotheses, you find ways to get rid of them. But there is no general purpose method to get rid of that. And it's a real field of research. It's not just a small part, it's a real field of research. It's very important for university, it's important for AI labs that are in companies. Being able to be fair is very, very, very important.
And can you maybe give us a few examples of these technical solutions you mentioned, if you say it's between statistics or...
An example? Okay. So you have a lot of statistical methods. For instance, I don't know if those of you who have already worked with data, but sometimes you want to ensure that the learning process that you put in motion is going to learn well and to predict well. And to do that, you have a lot of method to be sure that you can validate the model. To do that, you do some kind of you have the data, you separate them in the different parts, and you learn on some data and you test on some other data. And there's something that is quite similar with features. The features are just the biases that you can encode, for instance, race, gender, age, things like that. And you can do some kind of learning method where you put the age and you remove the age, and then you put the race and you remove the race, and you put the gender and the combination of all those, and you look at the variability of the model that you learn. If it's not, if it doesn't change, so it means that the variable that you set aside are not important related to for the bias. Otherwise, it means that it encodes something, and you have to get rid of that. Or depending on the thing, maybe you have to get rid of that.
Two really quick things. One is, I totally agree with everything Liva just said. That's fantastic. Basically, the bottom line is you do need domain expertise. It matters that you know things. And people are looking for this magic solution. You know, people said with the biases in our word vectors, you can get rid of that by adding noise. Yes, of course, you can get rid of all the signal by adding noise, but that doesn't leave you with anything for actually having natural language, right? But there was a question up here that's been flipping up and down, and I want to answer it even though it's not presently there. Somebody asked the question, shouldn't we be focusing on preventing failure rather than recovering from failure? And this is a really basic thing that was a part of my PhD. You have to do both, okay? Sometimes you can prevent failure, and we do everything we can to try to do things like verify a system. And like I was saying about in my earlier talk, that accountability is partly about documenting and logging in cyber-secure ways that you did the reasonable and tests appropriate to the danger of your system, right? And that not only testing it before you release it, but also monitoring it while it's out. And that's how systems work, right? That's how cars work that way, Facebook works that way. All kinds of things are constantly being monitored for errors. But that goes back to the answer. Sometimes it's provably impossible to predict everything that's going to happen in the future. So sometimes you also need to have, and it's easier to have a system that detects the failure. And so you need to be doing both. You need to be watching for it. And in the early days of AI, we thought we could just prove everything was correct. We wouldn't release anything that wasn't perfectly going to work. We didn't understand something that any computer scientist should know about, which is called combinatorics. It is just physically impossible to think of everything. And so that's why you need to do both.
So I think we've heard about very interesting technical solutions and how to both prevent and deal with the problems after. Maybe you can enlighten us on the social, political, maybe governance solution for this kind of failures.
Yeah, and to that, and building on Joanna's point, I completely agree. At the technical level, it's impossible to predict everything, and also almost certainly at the social, political level, it's entirely impossible to predict everything that could occur. And I think we also don't necessarily want to fall into the mode of assuming that the only real way to prevent failure is to do sort of complete ex-ante prevention. And I think the reason why that's bad is for a number of reasons, but one quite obvious one is that the only real surefire way to do that is to stop the technology from developing at all. And that's A, sort of implausible. A complete moratorium on AI development is not a plausible scenario in anyone's head, I don't think. And B, I think you also lose a lot of value. And we're on a panel where we're talking about failure modes and problems, but the implicit thing discussed that isn't being discussed but is here and that we all hopefully think in this room is that artificial intelligence also has a huge amount of potential upside, and it has delivered a huge amount of good and has uplifted well-being for a number of sort of segments across society, and the economy can benefit hugely from it. There are so many ways in which artificial intelligence can really benefit humanity, and so a moratorium, even if possible, is not a good idea for a number of different reasons. So that's a long way of saying that I think complete sort of in kind of governance speak, we call it precautionary sort of action. So taking all precautions to prevent everything bad from happening. I think that's both not feasible and also not desirable in this case. And then you walk into the tricky territory of how do you balance the two? So how do you do enough beforehand to ensure that it's broadly being steered in as good a direction as you can try to steer it, and then put in place, as Joanna said, the kind of things that will help you recover from it, detect failure modes, and be able to gracefully recover without having lost a huge amount of value. And I think if I had solutions, I would be out of a job, so I don't have many governance solutions to offer you straight off the bat, but I think a couple of things to toss out there is to the point of this kind of balance between doing stuff ahead of time and also putting in place systems in place. I think that's a necessary component of whatever governance system we put in place around artificial intelligence. And the other thing I'll point out is that I think it's important to make sure we have all of the important actors around the table. And one key point here is to recognize that oftentimes when you think about governance, you think about bringing governments around the table. I think in this case, as with most technology governance problems, you have to acknowledge that a lot of the development and a lot of the control and a lot of the domain expertise and a lot of the good ideas for where solutions can come from will also come from the research community, will also come from private companies who are developing it, and will also come from civil society and the public as well. And so ensuring that you have an appropriate amount of folks around the table in addition to governments is one way that we should stretch the way that we think about governance solutions, particularly for this kind of technology governance problem.
So I think one very important question is up there before we move on is could you please define the failure of AI? What is a failure for you? Just a low accuracy is a failure? So before we move on, I think it's important to clear out.
Again, that's a very important question, actually. So I have two answers. One that is very technical. One way to say that AI failed is to have a problem. For instance, a very simple problem, not a simple problem, but for instance, let's say a recognition problem. Recognizing some patterns in or some patterns in, I don't know, in stones, and humans are able to do better than AI. So you can say that AI failed, and you can, even if you work a bit more, you can go to NP hardness and things like that. That are problems that cannot be solved on a computer and things like that. But the other thing is, on the other extreme, is that I think that the notion to me, of AI failing is for systems built on AI not to deliver what they are supposed to do. For instance, if you build a system that is built for you to recommend you books, for instance, and you say that it's gonna broaden your horizon and you're gonna have a variety of books that you're going to be able to reach, and the fact that AI is going to tell you to look at exactly the same types of books and the same types of videos, then that's a failure, for instance, to me. And because you have some kind of a contract with the systems, and the systems deliver something totally different. So,
I would love to. That's great. I would love to answer the next question, Joanna. Is that okay?
Sure. Go for it.
Question. The argument about whose fault is it the engineers, or is it the companies, or is it society that allowed the company to exist? It's important to understand these are fundamental questions we've been working on for millennia. You know, AI isn't that big of a new deal, right? And so if a company's product fails, then that company is liable for that. But then if an individual deliberately sabotages it from inside of the company, then there'll be joint liability of some form. If the company can prove that, then their insurance may handle it in a different way, right? But it's still that they were allowing that to happen, which happens. Just think about banks, when people steal from inside of banks, and who's accountable for that. It's not that different. But the one thing that I really want to address in this question is, could the machine itself be accountable? Okay. What does accountability mean? In our society, the way by which we penalize people is by things like putting them in jail and taking their money away. So you can think of people, I mean, I personally am sort of horrified by people that have spent decades of their lives doing things politically that were questionable, and willingly messing up entire law, like I'm thinking about people, for example, that were operating in the Ukraine as political operatives. And then when they're faced with being away from their families for 2 or 3 years, they flip, right? That they say, oh, okay, now I don't believe that stuff anymore, and I'm happy to cooperate with and try to have fewer years in jail. Jail is a huge motivator for us because we've evolved. Like guppies are terrified of being isolated. We are not going to build those kinds of things into a maintainable, safe AI system. When we build systems, we make them modular so we can understand them, so we can be accountable for them, so we can debug them. And so the kind of systemic aversion that any social animal has to being isolated or to losing status or to having money taken away from it, that's not something we can build into a robot. Let's say that you had a robot and you put a bomb in it, and you put a camera and a timer, and you said, if you don't see a person within 5 minutes, then blow up the bomb, okay? And if you do that, you could say, well, that's worse than being human because I can be alone for 5 minutes and I don't blow up, right? But the point is that the whole rest of the robot hasn't changed, right? All the other reasoning, okay, maybe it's saying, okay, I can only have 5-minute goals now, but it doesn't have that systemic aversion. So we're over-identifying with AI if we think that we can dissuade it. And I can actually prove this because we have a case of this already, which is called legal personality for companies. Now that works if somebody in the company doesn't want to go bankrupt. It's your favorite store that you've set up, it's your grandfather's store and you're running it, then you don't want that company to go bankrupt. And so you can have legal personality and that works. But if you have a shell company, then the people making the decisions are not the ones who are going to go to jail, or maybe they've actually set it up deliberately to go bankrupt because that's a form of money laundering, right? So shell companies are an example of legal personality already extended too far into synthetic, artificial intelligence agents, which are companies. So it doesn't work. We already have a problem where there's too much accountability attempted to be put on things that don't care about it. So trust me, let's not do that with AI.
I have a general question about all the solutions we've been discussing. According to you, how much are we progressing towards this? Do we have good solutions? You're saying there is a lot of research. Are the solutions been found already and implemented in some cases? Are they available for people who would like to implement them in their own research or day-to-day action? Where can we find them?
Yeah, I think there's amazing solutions. I mean, and I encourage big tech companies often to release the tools for doing this kind of accountability, for revision control, also for machine learning, which we haven't been careful enough. It's perfectly doable, we just haven't been careful enough about tracking the provenance of our data sets and exactly when we tested them and how and when we decided to release it. So I think there are tools there for that. And also, I am... And at the governance level, I'm really impressed by how the conversations have improved from being a bunch of stuff that they've been fed by sci-fi to really quite pragmatic things. I mean, the OECD is today finalizing a 4-page thing about how they think AI should be governed. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that. But the conversation, just how the improvement over the last 2 or 3 years, not only from government, also from the corporations. Microsoft turned on a dime. The beginning of 2017, the beginning of the year, they were saying, oh, you can't regulate us, you'll lose the magic juice, which is deep learning, and then you won't have AI anymore. And then by, I think, October of that year, they had their principles out, which included human-centeredness, accountability, transparency, whatever. So the organizations and the governance, I mean, maybe it is an age of AI. We're all getting smarter faster. But when something really matters, for example, this democracy situation, the best minds on the planet are working on it, and they're coming up with some interesting solutions.
I love that Joanna is such an optimist. I agree that there is a significant improvement in the conversation in the past 2 years, 3 years. And for those of us who've been tracking it for this long, it's amazing to see so many more people talking about it and sounding somewhat sensible. But I will say that I think there is so much more work to be done. And we have a lot more stuff to figure out and then act upon. And I think we're still very much in the figuring out what we're trying to figure out kind of phase, particularly when it comes to a lot of longer term or at least medium term kind of questions. And if we're talking about a technology that we think is here to stay and is going to transform the economy economy and society and civilization for in a number of substantial ways for a time to come, then thinking with that kind of time frame, I think we have a lot more stuff to figure out. But that being said, I'd like to also particularly flag that what Joanna was saying about Microsoft, I think looking at the private sector, many of us can look at it quite skeptically and say private companies are rolling out these meaningless principles and they don't really have teeth. But if you look at it with a somewhat optimistic lens, it's actually quite amazing to see the amount of progress and quite credible pieces of communication, but not just communication, but also action that companies, particularly like Alphabet, DeepMind, OpenAI, Microsoft to some extent, Amazon to some extent, they've come out and made statements of the variety of something like, we feel we are responsible for making sure that this goes well. And that's a pretty novel turnaround for an industry to take when there is such a strong profit incentive. And also when I think the public have been less than coherent in what they're asking these companies to do. And even without that coherency, a lot of these companies have come out and at least said something that sounds somewhat reasonable. And then they need to translate it and do it in practice, and there's a lot more work to be done. But I think that is one silver lining, if you will, that I think is worth pointing out.
Yeah, no, I did want to say that I don't think it's enough for companies just to publish principles. It is important that we have centralized regulation, probably not just at the national level, definitely national level. I love the European Union as a model, actually. The fact that you come up with treaties between a bunch of nations, and then you get the nations to implement it in law locally. So that's a really nice dual model. And then you have, what was it, like 550 million people who are pretty damn affluent. They can do something like GDPR that protects the whole world as the world starts to pick up on it. It's not necessarily, but it's possible. It's a path forward. So yeah, I don't want to say, and of course some people seem to be releasing new principles all the time, ignoring the old principles just to try to get their flag waving. But yeah, I think even that now we're seeing a convergence on saying, okay, enough principles.
So I think now we've been rejoicing that we get new fields of research, new jobs generated by this failure of AI. So if we think we alternate between rejoicing if AI fails and fearing its success. So how do we strike a balance? What is the balance between these two?
Okay, I actually think, again, this goes back to what is consciousness for? So basically, we're all living our lives and having a fantastic time because of AI and getting, cheaper flights that are more aerodynamic and doing less damage and, all of these things have been optimized by AI. But of course, the things we are worrying about are the bad things. And that's what consciousness is for. We're trying to make sure the bad things don't happen too. So I do... we can say that we're alternating between these two things, but we're all actually walking out the door and using our smartphones to find the next party, right?
Yeah, I do agree that there is no balance and something like that. It's just that the field is moving. There are a lot of new things every day. And regarding the previous questions, there are a lot of tools available for everyone who wants to do artificial intelligence. They are pretty well packaged. It's very easy to use. And it means that the number of people who are going to use AI is going to increase, and it means that the number of problems or the possibility of failures is going to increase as well. But at the same time, you see there are government, there are companies, there are industry that are very aware of all the problems that can arise, and they are very cautious about how artificial intelligence is used. So there is this is the reason why we're all here. Actually, it's a time where now people just don't just say it's technology or it's technical thing. It's something that is everywhere, and that's the reason why there are a lot of people from different fields, from university, from companies, from governments that are thinking about the ethics of artificial intelligence. So the balance is we're looking for the balance every day. So it's a moving.
So I think you would disagree with the next question that maybe AI slow down progress and innovation due to the foundation on past data, and should we consider the current hype around AI as a threat for social progress?
Can I jump in and combine those two next questions?
Please do.
Because I think this is actually, it says, can AI create opportunity to, So can it actually slow down progress, right?
Yeah.
And I think those two things go together. Remember, artificial intelligence is something we're building. So if we use AI to damp things down so we don't have to think and make everything conform and always have it the same, then we will get stupider, right? And all of these things can happen, and it could slow progress, right? On the other hand, if we use it to keep innovating and to keep changing things, and we use it to keep redesigning our lives, then yes, we may also I haven't quite entirely answered the second question. So to finish answering the first question, then yeah, it is a possibility of a threat by holding us down if we're afraid to innovate because our government is looking for individuals who don't conform or that criticize it. If in that situation, if you're throwing people into re-education camps because they have some slight chance of criticizing you, then of course you're going to lose all your innovation. There's no question about that. But if you, on the other hand, I do like this thing about, it's not just about work, it's about wealth. People used to say that we wouldn't have to work in the future, right? And then people say, what happened to that? We're working more hours than we did in 1920. Well, in 1920, apparently we could live now as people lived in 1920 if we only worked 17 weeks a year. But nobody's content to live like people lived in 1920. We have so much better stuff now. And so we want all these things. But I agree that for both natural and artificial intelligence, it's our decision to push towards these bigger questions and the more interesting problems. We can decide if we want an economy based on bigger and bigger houses, which is unsustainable, or if we decide on an economy based on better and better decorated houses, Those are choices that we have to make as a society.
Sure. So maybe you want to add something? So to move on a bit, I have a question about, we said there are principles being published, people, governments trying to do things, but is it really something real, or is it a bit of more like I put this up and I say I'm doing ethical stuff and I'm trying to correct this, but actually not doing really the thing? And maybe I have a small example for this. I know in France we have this algorithm that is used to kind of dispatch the students in different universities. And the government itself, with promoting ethical AI, is not releasing all the code because it says it's still used as a help to decision. And so this, for me, is really kind of an example of how much it's easy to say big principles and then the differential still. And on the same idea for companies, I talked to people who were developing these fairness tools and putting it open to most of the public, but I told them, do you use it on your old algorithm to do promotion? They told me, it's complicated. So I think it's really a bit between the kind of saying what you need and then really acting on it.
Yeah. Again, this is the same in natural and artificial intelligence. I mean, it's like the British government it demands that all the universities have freedom of information, and then when people try to do freedom of information on the British government, they say, no, it doesn't apply to us, right? This is one of these things. We have these social contracts. We set these things up, and what we're saying, what a contract is, what a treaty is that you're saying, in advance, this is what the costs will be if you violate this, and you'll also get a bunch of people signed up to enforce those costs. But then you have to make those costs really high because you know that there's some chance that they won't be enforced, so that you really dissuade people. But this is constant. We're always trying to figure out how do we capture our government and make sure that they do the best things by all the people, or maybe we're all trying to make sure that it does the best thing by us, and that there's we coalition to try to make this work.
I think agree with that, and your point about being skeptical about this, I think, is definitely warranted. I think the view that I have on this is that it's as real as we collectively want it to be, and no governance system is complete. You have intentions and you have statements as the starting point, and that's how we've done governance and sort of change norms and change practices in industries for as long as we've known that we wanted to sort of rectify the way that companies act or the way that various other kinds of institutions act. And so I think there is always that first statement, and then you can be skeptical about that statement, but then we always need to put in systems of checks and balances, accountability, as we were talking about before, and it is not a complete system unless you have those checks and balances in place. And those checks and balances come from things that we collectively can build, we being entrepreneurs, we being civil society, we being members of the public, we being users of this technology, and also we being people who can influence governments who are also important parts of the system. And we've been talking a lot, for example, about private companies and what private companies are doing here. Governments necessarily sit alongside these private companies, and they have a lot of tools at their availability, which isn't just hard legislation. That will allow for these companies to be sort of incentivized in the right direction. But the point here being that it's we need to build these checks and balances in order for these things to end up having teeth. And I think you have a number of industries where you've seen the implementation of these checks and balances actually translate these statements into action. So if you think about this broad area of sort of environmentalism within companies, we started off not expecting companies to be environmentally friendly at all, and then we had this wave of awareness among the public that we need to protect the environment and that a lot of supply chains were harming the environment. And then I'm sure back in the day you had companies come out and do the equivalent of greenwashing, but now it's insufficient to greenwash, and now it's more or less a mainstream practice as a company to know that it's not acceptable in the eyes of your consumers and in the eyes of the public in general, and in the eyes of governments that you sort of have operating headquarters in. It's not acceptable to just say it. You have to actually do something about your supply chain to some extent. And in that case, we have a fair ways to go, but I think we've made a fair way of progress. And I think that is an example of many examples you can point to where you have the ability to put in checks and balances that will actually force some of these statements to translate into practice. It's something like fake it till you make it, except we can sort of encourage companies to make it by pulling on a number of different levers.
Yeah, I totally agree. Actually, I don't think that governments just states principles like that and they don't want to have them applied. It's just very difficult, you know, the question of being ethical, being fair, and things like that. They pose very complex problem from the algorithmic point of view. It's very hard to have nice solutions, taking into account all those biases, all those problems, and it's easier to use techniques that are known to be working first, and then there are different actors in the artificial intelligence field. There are companies, you have researchers, you have industries, you have governments, and they all have different goals. And so it's not very easy to have them all on the same page at the same time and saying now that's the way it's going to work. It's not working like that because they all have different laws applying to them. So. But I really think that looking at all the press, the things that are said about the government creating committees on AI, the use of AI, those committees made of people from government, people from industries, big companies, small companies, people from university. It says that there is a real will to implement that, but it's not from a practical point of view. It's very hard.
Yeah.
Once again, I'm totally agreeing with Liva, but I want to push that into an answer to a question we kind of dropped, which was this thing about how is AI just propagating the bias we've already had? Does it hold us back? Now, this is, again, intelligence is intelligence. Yes, if you only trained AI on the present moment and then froze the AI, you would have a problem, right? So, but this is something, anyone who's played with evolutionary algorithms knows this problem, and machine learning too, in a real-time system. You have constant trade-offs between, you know, the past. You could say it's a lot of biases, but actually it's amazing. Look at all this stuff we have. You know, if you just had some random baby born in the woods raised by wolves, would not have like this thing that's flying around all the time taking pictures of us, right? That would never happen, and you know, it'd take, I don't know, another 10 million years or something, right? Whereas, so we're mining the past, and we want enough stability. We want enough social stability so that we can build businesses, we can have families. We want that level of stability, but we don't want too much stability. So we have to choose thresholds about how long ago do we throw the information out for, or how do we combine it? What level of abstraction do we keep the older information? And what we tend to see is different people do this to different lengths, and then at different times, some of them are better off than others. But in general, you know, humanity really started exploding exponentially when we got writing. Writing allowed us to write stuff down and remember. So for 10,000 years, we've just been doing, in fact, too much, right, from the sustainability practice, but a lot of amazing things. So I think you don't want to throw away the past. You want to keep improving on it. And it's a hard technical problem about the trade-offs that we can only do exploration and keep trying to come up with better solutions and watching each other's solutions and keep looking for the moments.
So I think you've started saying that it's difficult, that actors have different things they answer to. So if we would need to regulate more, what would norms or regulation look like that would promote this type of AI?
Again, if I had answers, I wouldn't be here. I think so first statement is to say that we collectively, and particularly folks working on this problem in the research space, this is a hard question to answer. And I don't want to wave my hand away and give you sort of my top 3 norms, because it's not that easy. And it is a very hard question to figure out what exactly are these good norms that we want to encourage among, say, for example, regulatory institutions, but basically any institution that is engaged in developing and deploying and controlling these technologies. What are good norms? So this question of what are good norms is a very, very tricky one. I think the first couple of things that come to mind that seem robustly good norms, sort of irrespective of what you think these systems are going to look like, particularly as they develop in the next couple of years and couple of decades. I think one norm that is good to encourage is sort of transparency and verification. Those two things seem important, and I'll dig into those two in a little bit more detail. I think transparency is that when you have actors who don't necessarily trust each other to be doing sort of the right thing, offering to show them what you're doing and being transparent and open about it to a reasonable extent, that is an important part, and that's an important norm to encourage, particularly among, say, for example, companies and AI labs. And the demonstration of being transparent, I think, also signals that you do intend to be cooperative. And I'll sort of take a bit of a sidestep to arms control, which sounds like a bit of a strange sort of analogy, but in this case, if you're thinking about arms control as this problem of a very powerful set of technologies that actors want to pursue for selfish advantage, a lot of the groundwork for arms control agreements going well is for folks to commit to transparency measures and to say, I'm going to show you what I have if you show me what you have. So I think transparency in general is a good norm. It's a difficult one, but it's a good one. And then the flip side of that I'll point to is being able to verify that a certain system that you're developing or that a certain set of practices that you're implementing, they are actually doing what you intend them to do. And so committing to this kind of transparency and verification process, I think in general seems like a good norm to encourage cooperation, to encourage people to be on the same page about what you're going for, to also encourage people to basically all come to the table sort of at the same time with the same willingness. And I think in this case there are a few folks who really need to come to the table at the moment, but the more that we develop this technology and the more capabilities that we have, the more important it'll be to make sure that we can establish that norm and sort of spread that across anyone who's developing and deploying this kind of technology.
So maybe before we move on to more questions, I want to ask you one last thing. What is the role of education in all of this? Because a lot of the data scientists or the engineers that come and work today in AI are maybe not trained to deal with this kind of problems. So do you think this is a correct assessment or not? And if not, what would training look like? And who should we bring into this conversation?
Well, at Bath, we just started a new Center for Doctoral Training in accountable, responsible, and transparent AI, art AI. And for us, what we're doing is we're bringing in students from any background, and then they have 1 year of training, and they have to take courses, and they have to choose supervisors between 2 disciplines. So we're trying to make a whole lot of pairwise experts. I mean, personally, I have a liberal arts degree from America, which you don't get in Britain. In Britain, you specialize actually quite young. You take A levels, up until the age of, 17 or something. And then, so you stop having general education when you're 15. And it's an issue. You can do things like transfer degrees when you're an adult. But I have a liberal arts degree, and then I did a transfer degree to AI, and then I did a PhD in computer science. My first degree was actually psychology. But I spent a lot of time in education. It's not clear you really want to have every adult have spent 20 years, in post-secondary education. But I think that goes back to diversity. So we can pump these things, like we can pump ethics and some social science. I mean, even in Britain, if you're in Scotland, you get a 4-year undergraduate degree if you're an honors student. And so you have time to take psychology and ethics and some other things, even if you're a computer science major. Whereas in England, it's 3 years even for the honors students. So these are all choices, huge social choices we're making. And I will say, I know I'm meandering, but I'll say one other thing. There's an issue about self-learning and acknowledging that people have learned things. So I get invited to give talks at conferences, say in biology, after I've published some biology papers, even though I have no degrees in biology. There's a point where, like, well, if you publish that paper, then you must know enough that it's worth having you come out and talk, right? So I think there may be a role for certification, and that there will be more and more with AI, more and more people self-learning, and then. But there's still a use of having cohorts and having that experience of being around people that are really different from yourself. So I do worry, again, AI failure. One of the AI failures I worry about is the fragmenting of society, because it's easier to stay home and be entertained instead of going out and forming relationships with the people who happen to live close enough to you that you can actually build something up. But anyways, I still think you should send your kids to university, please. But I also think we need to find ways to certify people's education and acknowledge that. And so even if they're at university, they could go through faster, or they could do more, because they already have some courses under their belt, things like that.
To build on that, I'd be very excited about education, particularly in the vein of creating the notion of a responsible research community. And I think because, particularly in AI, where researchers are so important, and talent is so important, and fundamental research is consistently very important in pushing the field forward, that all means that researchers have a lot of political clout, if you will, and they're very important people to influence in the way that they conceive of how responsible they are for the things that they create, and the kinds of things that they think through as they're developing these systems and deploying these systems. I think any initiative in the education umbrella, broadly speaking, that sort of helps to imbue that responsibility, I'm very excited about that. I think one thing to point out about education is that it seems very slow. Like, it takes multiple generations, and it's this broad, very robust, but very slow-moving kind of way of impacting change. And we all know that this technology is moving a lot faster than we can keep up with. And so I think with education, it's sort of useful, but it seems insufficient to me, at least as a single intervention. And maybe the last thing I'll point out is that I would be very excited about seeing more around the idea of professionalizing the engineering discipline or the CS discipline in a way that has that responsibility as part of being a professional engineer or being a professional computer scientist. And the kind of analogous profession I can point to is in medicine, for example. So you've got doctors, and they all have signed the Hippocratic Oath. I'm not entirely sure how doctors actually go about doing that, but there's this very strong notion that as a doctor, you are certified to act in a responsible way no matter what country you operate in. And that's with the view that doctors are very important parts of our society, and they deliver this very important service, and they are directly dealing with lives and healthcare, and that's a really fundamental part of what it means to have a trustworthy profession. And so translating that into the context of engineering and CS, I'd be curious as to how important that would be, is professionalizing that engineers are doing a thing and deploying things that has a huge impact on society. And so the idea that you should be responsible for thinking things through, and that being part and parcel of what it means to be a good professional. I'd be pretty excited about that, and I'd say that because it seems faster than education in a lot of ways.
I totally want to support that, but I want to give my analogy I usually use as architects. So it used to be that architects, anybody rich could just build a building anywhere. And now architects get educated at university about how to work on policy. They have to get licensed. The buildings have to get inspected. And why? Because society decided that it wasn't okay to have buildings fall on people and kill them all the time. And they noticed that where you put a building also totally changed your city and the flow of traffic and things like that. So basically, AI has started falling on people and killing them. So I think we're in a situation where we're about to come into the licensing. I agree.
Okay, I'm going back to the question of education and or the question of failure of AI. There's something that we didn't talk about was one of the failures would be for some part of the people knowing a lot of AI and some of other people on some part of people from a country not knowing anything about AI. So there's that's not, we're not very far from that. And one of the ways to avoid that is to precisely have initiatives like teaching things about AI from the younger age at primary school or elementary school. It's doable. You can do that. It's not that difficult to talk about AI, to talk about the problems that we've been talking about. You can do that right away. It just requires a bit of thinking, but it might also be done in accordance with the other subject that you learn at school, and it might be some ways to have citizens who know about AI. And the other thing is for people in universities, students, there are a lot of initiatives. Actually, I've been working on that in my universities to have courses, classes of AI, bringing together people from social sciences, from law, from medical school, because they're all interested in that. They don't exactly know what is going on there. And we try to put some new programs to teach to these people so that there is no, on this one side, the people from computer science and mathematicians who know a lot about AI, and the other who don't know, and they are like, wow, I'm afraid of what is going on. I don't even know what is going on. So it's something that I know in universities, but I know in companies. It's very important for people to know and to get some knowledge about what are the ins and outs of AI.
So I think to finish, thank you for this. We'll take a few more questions if you can put them up there from the audience. Yes. So. Yes, let's talk about AI for digital surveillance and the threat to democracy. Who want to start on this?
8 minutes.
So, this is a situation we're already in. I mentioned before about what was happening in China. Let's talk about this in a little more detail. So, one thing that was happening is, I'm terrible at okay.
Xinjiang is.
Yeah, that's the province which is closest to actually Afghanistan. It touches Afghanistan. So and there's Muslim people, the Uyghurs, who have been there's 12 million of them, and 1 million are in re-education right now. And China has been astounded by the amount of response this has happened. I mean, one of the things we forget is in the 20th century. There was something like over 120 cases of mass killings. It wasn't just the 2 or 3 that we hear about all the time. So quite often people will decide that some part of a subpopulation is too problematic. Anyway, I'm going too much on a digression. What's happening with the Uyghurs is that they have everything about them is being monitored, and if they have anything that seems to be coming in that indicates that they're picking up the Wahhabist version of Islam. So they were okay with their own version of Islam as far as the Chinese authorities were concerned, but what they were freaked out about is when they saw the Saudi influence coming in, the Wahhabism coming in, then they said, this is a disaster, we don't want to have that kind of extremism here, and so then they started trying to repress this entire people in a way that they'd already been repressing people in Tibet. So that's one problem. A completely different problem with the social credit system, and a lot of Han Chinese don't realize this, but lots of Han Chinese are not able to fly or are disappearing into jail, and aren't able to take trains even anymore. And some of them are people who've done bad things, like apparently walking your dog without a leash, or smoking on a train, something like that. And that's, I don't know if that's bad enough to be banned from flight, but that's what, that's the kind of thing that can zero your social credit. But also, what of course I notice as an academic is professors who study the Chinese government or who study human rights, suddenly they can't fly. And there's no indication that they were smoking on trains, right? It seems much more that the system is being used to control people. Now, I don't want to pick on only one country. America has a credit system as well that we use, and it's not quite the same, but we also have a larger proportion of our population in jail than any other country, I believe, right? It's unbelievable. It's like a quarter or a fifth of all the people in jail in the world are in jail in America, which is nuts. It's absolutely nuts. And we don't talk about that. There's a guy named, literally a guy named Guy Standing. Guy Standing is a left-wing economist in the UK, and he claims that because I don't know if you remember, the most recent time we've had riots, to my knowledge, I haven't checked the news today, was 2014 in London. There was a lot of surveillance cameras that would capture people, just looting a little tiny thing, like, taking some tampons or something, and then those people went to jail. And so Guy Standing claims that this is why there's this very unfair thing that's happened with the welfare system, where if you make a minor violation, you can lose money for months. And these are people who already have nothing. That's why they needed the welfare in the first place. And so they're afraid, he thinks they're afraid to protest it because they've seen this thing about, now we know you know who I am because I've already gotten the sanction. So if I protest it, then you're going to take me on even longer. And so he thinks that this is contributing to the increase of suicide because it's literally no way out. So if he's right, I'm not a total expert, but if he's right, then that would indicate that in the UK, the people that are the poorest have very little liberty, and not just because they can't buy things, but because they're getting the policing that we associate with China happening to them. And there's a spectrum of liberty in the UK about, me as an academic, as a professor, I can say anything like this. I can get out and criticize my governments, both of my governments at once, and I'm not going to go to jail tomorrow. But the head of Interpol in China disappeared, right? But a lot of people are getting hurt already, yeah.
Maybe just to add to that, I think this is a terrifying example of how AI is being used today. And I think one layer to why this is so terrifying is because it's a very hard problem to stop from happening. And there are two reasons why I think it's particularly hard. One is that the very same technologies that a lot of these authoritarian governments, for example, or repressive governments are using are the same technologies that we have commercial applications for. So facial recognition technologies you see in a lot of retail stores, and you see it sort of being used for sort of quite legitimate and good law enforcement applications that will make our societies more secure, but at the same time, exactly the same companies and exactly the same products can't be used for things like what's happening in Xinjiang. And the reason why it's hard is because it's the same product and it's the same company. And in China, for example, you've got SenseTime, which is their leading facial recognition company. That's the company's technology that's being used in this province. But SenseTime also has a number of other products that are being used by Chinese consumers, which are benefiting them as consumers in a huge way. So it's a hard problem because you've got this kind of, we call it the dual use problem in governance speak, which is that it's the same technology that you want to be used for useful things, but also it can be used for bad things at the same time. The other reason why I say that it's a particularly hard problem as well is because the canonical statement of technology is neutral, but the actors that use it are the ones that make it good or bad. In this case, for example, if you're talking about AI and democracy, we've seen artificial intelligence, and particularly certain algorithms and bots, being used to disrupt and undermine liberal democratic systems. But at the same time, you can think of a lot of ways in which AI can be used to support these systems too. So you can have clearer information provision. you can have sort of better ways of leveling the playing field when it comes to decision making, etc. And those are applications of AI technologies that you can also use to bolster liberal democratic systems too. And so in that way, I think this statement points to, AI is to some extent what we want to use it for. And so the governance and the social problem, to kind of revert back to that, is ultimately about controlling the incentives that we have for using these systems, and also about constraining the use of them in some ways. But then and to revert back to the first problem, I think what you want to constrain is the way in which they are used, because it's quite hard to constrain the actual products themselves, because they do have this kind of dual use characteristic to them.
I think it's we're not going to have anonymity back. What we have to do is have the kind of protection that we have for our personal property, for our data, and the prediction in our liberty and our freedom to have opinions. And the EU has made a big step forward to that with the GDPR. They've said our citizens' data, for each nation, our citizens' data is a part of our citizens, right? I was thinking we need another word, like, how there's like sex and there's rape, that's two different words. We need two words for nudging. So nudging is like sex. It's like something you might want to do. But there needs to be something when people have forced you to do something without your consent, or coerced you to do something without your consent. Anyway, so the point is that to stop that happening, they've said we are going to define this. But how? This is something, if you're looking for a text thing to do, I think we need kind of like a web crawler. We need something that crawls the internet and looks for where people have been predicted, their behavior are being manipulated. I think we have to start looking for the patterns that indicate the patterns are being used, like a meta manipulation device. But it is super hard, but all we can do is fight. I think we have to work hard. And again, nothing is new. If you look at World War II, when the Nazis got into Belgium and they got into the Netherlands, they killed a lot more of the Jewish people in the Netherlands. Why? Because the Dutch were more organized. So they had clear records of everybody's religion, and so then they were able to wipe out the Dutch Jews. The Belgians were apparently not very organized, and more of their Jewish population survived. So these are problems we've had, but are magnified by the digital, that we can change on a dime now, what we use our technology for.
So I think we know now we really have to keep working hard on this. And on this, I want to thank all our speakers of this roundtable, please. And I think that's it. Thank you.